Welcome to this video on the signs of the apocalypse to expect before the appearance of the Messiah of the latter days, otherwise known as the return of the Christ Spirit. But before we begin, we need to set the record straight a bit here. The word apocalypse doesn't mean what you probably think it means. The word apocalypse, a term from the book of Revelation, from the original Koine Greek, the apocalypsis that you see there on the screen, when translated from the Koine Greek that the book of Revelation was originally written in, it means revelation or disclosure. A revelation or disclosure from God, not death and destruction that you might have thought it meant, although some death and destruction does occur as a byproduct of the fulfillment of these prophecies in the book of Revelation and Matthew. Note that in this video we will cover a few key signs of the return of the Messiah, but not all of them. Just those given in the book of Matthew, chapter 24, verses 29, 30, and 31 primarily. For a more complete review of Bible prophecies and how most have been fulfilled already, see my other videos. Is your memory a little fuzzy about these prophecies in the 24th chapter of the book of Matthew, of the sun being darkened and the moon failing to shine and some other signs? Well, here are some reminders. At the beginning of chapter 24, the disciples asked Jesus what the signs of his coming, his returning, would be. What would signal the second advent of the Messiah? Jesus responded by speaking of the coming abomination of desolation and persecution, false prophets appearing. The great tribulation, distress, oppression will occur, depending on what translation of the Bible you're reading. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars will fall from heaven. Then the Son of Man will come in the clouds of heaven, his angels will come with the sound of a trumpet, and more. In this video, we will concentrate on the prophecies in just verses 29, 30, and 31 of the chapter 24 of Matthew, the most well-known source of these prophecies. Those three verses from the book of Matthew, chapter 24, are very similar to events foretold in the books and verses listed here, too. From the book of Isaiah, chapters 13, 24, and 60, a verse in Ezekiel, and 3 verses in the book of Joel from the Old Testament. Then there's 5 similar descriptions in the New Testament's book of Mark, Luke, Acts, and the book of Revelation, in addition to the book of Matthew. This explanation in this video of the meanings of Matthew chapter 24 verses 29, 30, and 31 also apply to these verses listed here. A side note here for your information, I have 2 other videos that review the prophecies and warnings that Christ gave about his future return that are in chapter 24 of the book of Matthew, not just verses 29 through 31, but all 51 verses of Matthew. These 2 videos are entitled The Sun Will Be Darkened, Matthew chapter 24, Prophecies Fulfilled, Parts 1 and 2. Part 1 is about 3.5 hours in length, and Part 2 is almost 3 hours long, for a total of about 6.5 hours to watch both of them. Realizing that people just don't want to watch videos that long, I decided to just break out the explanations of verses 29, 30, and 31 in this separate video. If this video sparks some interest in watching the complete story of all the prophecies in chapter 24 of Matthew, please go to my YouTube channel, Integral Destiny 9, and seek them out. But now let's get started with the discovery of the meanings of verses 29 through about 31, 32, about the sun darkening and the moon failing to shine, etc., before the appearance of the Messiah of the Second Advent, the return of the Christ Spirit. Please join me for this true story of how these prophecies have been fulfilled. It is an entirely new and logical way of looking at Bible prophecy fulfillment. And yes, it means that the Christ Spirit has returned, just as Jesus promised he would. Here's the plan of how this information will be covered in this video, in this table of contents. Section 1 of the video is a fairly brief introduction to the two divine teachers who fulfilled its promises in the mid to late 1800s. Their divine titles were the Bab, which means the gate in English, and Baha'u'llah, which means the glory of God in English. This section is short, and you do not have to believe this information to get a deeper understanding of these prophecies and how they might be fulfilled, even if you do not believe that these two new manifestations of God fulfill them. So please keep watching. Just ignore the comments about the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Section 2 will be some background information on the Bible version used in this video and why some important translation changes have been made from the first, occasionally incorrect English translations of the original Greek text of the Bible, and then a few tidbits of information about the meanings of some of the terms in chapter 24. Section 3 is incredibly important. There is very little in the way of time frames given for these foretold events in Matthew chapter 24. However, there are time prophecies in the books of Daniel in the Old Testament and Revelation at the end of the New Testament that give us a definitive year around which to place these events. Section 4 is simply a read-through of chapter 24, verses 29 through 31. It's a very short section. Section 5 is a tiny introduction into Matthew 24 as a whole. In fact, all of the prophecies in the Bible addressing the issue of literal versus spiritual interpretation of these specific verses. In Part A of Section 5, we will go into depth on how these verses, 29 through 31, were indeed literally fulfilled. In Part B of Section 5, how these verses were spiritually fulfilled by these two new manifestations of God will be reviewed. Again, if you just cannot accept that the Christ Spirit has already returned in the persons of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, reviewing some possibilities of what spiritual fulfillment means versus literal fulfillment might help you understand these prophecies more clearly. It's all very interesting. I hope you will watch both parts. Section 6 is just a brief review of some sources of information if you'd like to investigate the claims of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and the Baha'i faith which they founded further. So we start here where the red box appeared at the top, with an introduction to the two new manifestations or prophets of God, the Elijah figure and the new Messiah, who have already appeared in our world back in the mid to late 1800s in the Middle East. It's fairly short. If you really don't want to hear about it, you can just fast forward through the next 13 or so slides to get to Section 2. This video will explain when and how he returned and the evidence that the prophecies in Matthew chapter 24 have been fulfilled by two divine messengers. First, the herald, the Elijah figure, just as John the Baptist was, and number 2, the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ, and also the Jewish Messiah, and also, by the way, the promised one of all the major faiths on earth. Now for a little recent history to give you some background. On May 23, 1844, a young man in Shiraz, Persia, announced that he was the promised one, but also the herald of one greater than he, that he called him whom God shall make manifest, meaning the Messiah of the latter days, who would soon appear. The divine title of this young man was the Bab, which means the gate in English. The Bab was born in 1819 in Shiraz, Persia. He was a descendant of Abraham through Hagar. He also was a descendant of the prophet Muhammad. The Bab spread the word that God had a new message for this day, and the Messiah would bring even more good news when he would appear. Many, many thousands of devoted followers arose from every part of Persian society, to the dismay of both the Muslim clergy and the government led by Muhammad Shah Qajar. The Persian government, upon promptings from the clergy, put the Bab to death on July 9, 1850, in Tabriz, Persia. This is a photo of the shrine of the Bab on the side of Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel. This is the final resting place of the Bab and the site of pilgrimages from the followers of the new faith from all corners of the globe. Through that gate, the Bab, humankind would attain the new Messiah, whose divine title is Baha'u'llah, which means the glory of God in English. Baha'u'llah was born in 1817 in Tehran, Persia, the son of a nobleman who was a minister in the court of the Shah of Persia. Baha'u'llah was a descendant of the last king of the Sasanian dynasty of kings of Persia, as well as a descendant of Abraham through both Sarah and Keturah, two of Abraham's 3 wives. Baha'u'llah initially was a follower of the Bab, one of the Bab's chief disciples. The Persian government launched a deadly vendetta against the followers of the Bab, they were called Babis, in which thousands perished, sometimes from disgustingly brutal methods. Baha'u'llah was banished from his homeland and sent into forced exile to Baghdad, which was then a city in the Ottoman Empire. That was in early 1853. After 2 additional forced exiles from Baghdad, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire banished him and several others to the prison city of Akka, Palestine, also known as Acre. This is a map of the Middle East as it was at the time of the Bab and Baha'u'llah in the mid to late 1800s. On the right you can see the western part of Persia, that's the area that has the greenish background, and the Ottoman Empire, that's the dark tan areas. It shows the exiles of Baha'u'llah, the red and yellow line that starts in Tehran, Persia on the far right. Baha'u'llah was first exiled to Baghdad, where he lived for about 10 years. Then, at the request of the Persian government and clergy, the Ottoman Empire removed him further northwest to Constantinople, now called Istanbul. But that did not stop Baha'u'llah from guiding his followers, now called Baha'is, even from Istanbul. So Persia still pressed the Ottomans to do something about him. So the Ottomans sent Baha'u'llah to Adrianople, now called Edirne. This still was not satisfactory to the enemies of Baha'u'llah and his faith, so they sent him to Akka, Palestine, which was a prison city. The conditions in that prison cities were so deplorable they thought for sure he'd die and his religion with him. Baha'u'llah arrived in Akka, Palestine in 1868 and entered the city through the sea gate. He would never leave that area for the remainder of his life. He passed on to the Abha kingdom, heaven, in 1892. Abha kingdom means glorious kingdom in English, meaning heaven, the spiritual realm. Basically, Baha'u'llah was imprisoned or under house arrest for the most part of 40 years, all because he claimed he brought a new revelation from God. His burial site and shrine is outside the city of Akka. This is the sanctuary of Baha'u'llah, his final resting place after a life of suffering and devotion to the revelation that God sent him to teach to us. His ministry on earth lasted for 40 years. Some additional information here about the Bab and Baha'u'llah, because they may very well be very new names to you. So I want to introduce you to them as shortly and concisely as I can. So the Bab means English, in English, the gate. Some other divine titles for the Bab from the Bible are the return of Christ in the station of Elijah, the herald and forerunner of the Messiah of this new era, and he is the Lamb of the book of Revelation, and he was a thief in the night. He was born in 1819 in Persia and died by firing squad by order of the King of Persia in 1850. And he made his first proclamation of his divine identity in 1844, Common Era. Next, Baha'u'llah, which in English means the glory of God. His other divine titles that you might recognize come from the Bible. He's the return of Christ in the station of the Father. He is the Messiah of the second coming, or the Messiah of the second advent. He is the one who sits on the throne of the book of Revelation. And he too was a thief in the night. They were both thieves in the night because they taught their new revelations, and then they passed on to the heavenly realm with fairly few followers at that time. And even now in this year of 2022, so very few in the world ever knew they existed. Now, the Baha'u'llah was born in 1817, passed away in the Holy Land in 1892. He proclaimed his identity as the Messiah for this new age in 1863. He actually had his revelation of his being the Messiah while he was imprisoned in the year late 1852. The glory of God, or the glory of the Lord, is prophesied as coming throughout the Old and the New Testaments of the Holy Bible, especially in the book of Revelation. Most of these references to the glory of God or the glory of the Lord are direct references to Baha'u'llah, the Messiah of the latter days, or second advent of the Messiah. The new faith that resulted from their lives and teachings is the Baha'i faith. There are about 10 million Baha'is in the world, located all across the globe. There's about 170,000 of us in the USA. And the world center of the Baha'i faith is in Haifa, Israel, on Mount Carmel. Just to assure you that this is all real, here's an aerial photo of the main administrative buildings of the Baha'i World Center on Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel. I visited Haifa on religious pilgrimage in 2010. I've been in 3 of these 4 buildings and walked in the gardens surrounding them. They are very real. The Baha'i Faith's World Center is in Israel because the last 24 years of Baha'u'llah's life was spent as a prisoner of the Ottoman Empire in Akka, Palestine, which was used as a prison city for the Ottoman Empire at that time. Akka is across the Haifa Bay from the World Center's location on Mount Carmel in Haifa. At this point, this is all I'll tell you about the Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i Faith. Much more will be explained as I review in this video the fulfillment of Matthew 24 prophecies by the Baha'i Faith founders and their faith. Here are 3 websites should you wish to learn more about the Baha'i Faith, its founding figures, history, beliefs, community, among other points of interest. The 2 websites at the top are good starting points to get some information about the faith and its main figures. The top one, Baha'i.org, is the official international site of the Baha'is of the world. The Baha'i.us website is the official website for the Baha'is of the United States. If you are interested in reading some of the sacred and authoritative texts of the Baha'i Faith, there is a free online library through the website at the bottom there, Baha'i.org/library. Now we go on to section 2 to review some Bible prophecy terminology and some other tidbits of background information. First, some differences between some versions or translations of the Bible into English need to be addressed and clarified. In recent decades, it appears that some Christians who tend to interpret Bible prophecies literally, with little acceptance of possible spiritual interpretations of some prophecy passages, are only willing to accept the King James Version, the one compiled in the year 1611, over 400 years ago. Here are a few of the differences in terms between the New International Version of Matthew 24, that's in the middle column, and the King James Version text in the right column, just as a matter of interest. The NIV is short for New International Version, and the letters KJV is short for King James Version of the Bible. Verse 3, at the top there, is where the end of the age phrase is located. End of the world in the King James Version. The end of the age is more correct, according to more recent understandings of what the original Koine Greek actually translates to English as. Verse 12, the NIV text speaks of an increase in wickedness, whereas the King James states iniquity shall abound. Verses 21 and 29, instead of tribulation, as mentioned in the King James, it is referred to as distress in the New International Version. The original Koine Greek word is thlipsis. Note, the Messiah for this new era, Baha'u'llah, states that the best translation of this word, especially in Matthew 24, is oppression. As he states, quote, the Greek word used, thlipsis, has two meanings, pressure and oppression, end quote. Further comments will be offered when we get to those later verses in this presentation. In verse 28, the NIV speaks of vultures, but the King James Version uses the word eagles. The NIV term vultures seems to give a truer sense that the bird is feeding off the dead carcasses mentioned in that verse. Again, experts in the Greek used around the time of Jesus in that part of the world now know more precisely what the best Greek to English translation should be. Verse 29, the NIV text uses the phrase heavenly bodies, whereas the King James uses powers of the heavens. There are three different ways Bible prophecies can be fulfilled. Literally, that is, material fulfillment in this earthly realm, or spiritually, meaning the words in Bible verses that are prophecies are used symbolically to represent spiritual events or conditions, rather than literal material events. Or sometimes, not always, both literal and spiritual fulfillment of some prophecies. Next, an abbreviated heavenly dictionary of some key words will be reviewed. What they mean when defined literally is in the middle column. Then in the right column, what they mean spiritually or symbolically. The words themselves are in the left column. There are only a few terms here to give a taste of the expansiveness of the spiritual meanings of these terms. More terms may be addressed as we get into the actual prophecy explanation. Note that some of the symbolic meanings are from the Baha'i sacred writings, often from the pen of Baha'u'llah himself. Who would know better the meanings of Bible prophecies than the Messiah himself? First, at the top, what is an earthquake? Literally, it's shaking of the ground, often with damage to buildings and sometimes, unfortunately, resulting in injuries and deaths. But what in the world would a symbolic earthquake be? Looking at the column on the right, we see some ideas on how an earthquake occurring can be symbolic or spiritual in meaning. Some examples. an earthquake in society, an earthquake in institutions or regimes, etc., means that power centers are shaken and weakened. They become unstable, possibly collapse entirely. Other examples, the earthquake of doubts, or the pillars of the world can be shaken, meaning the foundations of a society are shaken and possibly destroyed, requiring rebuilding. Next term, heavenly bodies. According to the New International Version translation. Literally, that would mean our sun and moon, all the planets and their moons in our solar system, and all the constellations of other stars and their planets and moons. Then we have the comets, asteroids, and other objects in outer space. Some of these other objects can become meteors affecting our planet when they breach our atmosphere and gravity and fall towards Earth. The symbolic meanings of heavenly bodies would include the manifestations of God, also known as the prophets, with a capital P, prophet. More about that shortly. And divine luminaries. Heavenly bodies can be symbolic of humans who become leaders of religion, but who are not divine prophets of God. The context of the prophecy text may indicate which applies, whether it's a prophet, capital P, prophet of God, or a human person in the high echelons of power. By the way, I always use a capital P when referring to manifestations or prophets of God, those who bring a revelation from God and their own laws and sacred texts as the foundations of their faiths, such as Moses and Jesus, Muhammad, the Bab, and Baha'u'llah. Small p prophets include the minor prophets, such as Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the like. Next, the term sun, S-U-N. The literal meaning in the middle column is obvious, the fixed star which is the center of our solar system. The symbolic meanings of sun is in the right column. There are a couple. In some contexts of verses, it means a manifestation, also known as a prophet of God, those who bring a revelation from God. Here is a quote that gives an example of the spiritual expansiveness of a symbolic meaning to referring to something as a sun, S-U-N. This is a quote from Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah. This is about the Son of Truth, foretold in the New Testament as coming in the future, and whom Baha'u'llah fulfills. Quote, "It is a lovely day. The sun shines brightly upon the earth, giving light and warmth to all creatures. The Son of Truth is also shining, giving light and warmth to the souls of men. The sun is the life-giver to the physical bodies of all creatures upon earth. Without its warmth their growth would be stunted, their development would be arrested, they would decay and die. Even so do the souls of men need the Sun of Truth to shed its rays upon their souls, to develop them, to educate and encourage them. As the sun is to the body of a man, so is the Sun of Truth to his soul." End quote. In another sense, sun can refer to the leaders of the religions of past dispensations. Sun can also mean the laws and teachings of those previous dispensations. However, when a new manifestation of God brightens the world with his revelation from God, those previous suns have set. Their spiritual light dims in comparison with the new revelation. To everything there is a season, if you recall. A star in our material universe is a fixed luminous object in our night sky, which is a huge, remote, incandescent body like our own sun, only most of those stars are the same size or larger than our sun. Moons are natural satellites of planets. Moons do not generate or give off light of their own, but rather only reflect light from other sources, the stars of our universe. The symbolic or spiritual meanings of stars and moons are the leaders of religions, not manifestations of God, but rather they are purely human people who gain leadership positions in the religious communities of humankind. In another sense, Sun, stars, and moons can represent the laws and teachings of the previous dispensations when a new manifestation of God appears. These older laws and teachings can dim in influence in the world, meaning become darkened or lose their light after the new manifestation of God appears in the world and brings updated laws for us. Then we go to the term falling or fallen stars. If we are speaking of literal stars in the universe, such an occurrence cannot happen. Stars do not fall. If speaking of falling to Earth, to the surface of our planet, this is absolutely impossible. As one great Baha'i thinker put it, quote, "It would be as though 1,000 million of Himalaya mountains were to fall upon a grain of mustard seed." End quote. It's impossible. So this must mean, if it were to be fulfilled literally, that these stars must be meteors, asteroids, or comets, although they do not really meet the definition of a star since they do not give off their own light, but rather reflect light, or the light is reflected as they travel through our atmosphere. Just for your information, our sun is 109 times the size of Earth, and our sun is only an average-sized star. The largest known star in our universe is about 1,700 times larger than our sun. So much for such bodies to fall to our Earth, literally. But what about symbolic falling or fallen stars? What could that mean? The fall of religious leaders who, because they denied the revelation of Baha'u'llah, are losing their influence over mankind. That's per Baha'i author and historian Adib Taherzadeh. The Pharisees were fallen stars at the time of Jesus because they denied his being the Messiah. The priests of ancient Egypt who rejected Moses were fallen stars. The leaders of idolatrous religions in Arabia who rejected Muhammad and his teachings of one God were the fallen stars of the Muhammadan dispensation. Note that the spiritual and symbolic meanings of prophecies, or their spiritual fulfillment, are far more important, more deeply meaningful, and long-lasting in effect than mere literal fulfillment of prophecies. Also, you will encounter this term, manifestation of God, throughout this video. This term is used in reference to all of God's messengers, from Abraham, Krishna, Buddha, Moses, Zoroaster, Jesus, Muhammad, to the Bab and Baha'u'llah, the latest ones. They are manifestations of the attributes of God, but they are not incarnations of God. Incarnation means that God would descend from the spiritual realm to reside in a human body. That would be something on the order of saying that the entire Pacific Ocean was to be put into a teacup. Rather, these manifestations of God are perfect mirrors that reflect the spiritual power, majesty, omnipotence, knowledge, and all the attributes of God to us, God's creation. We see God reflected in them, and they speak for God on earth. Because we see the spiritual image of God in these manifestations, it is as if we are seeing God when we see them. As God promised Abraham, he will continue to send these manifestations of himself to us, his creation, forever, to guide us spiritually, because we need guidance. Okay, we are done with our brief review of Bible prophecy terminology. Onward to talking about Bible time prophecies of when Messiah would appear. As we investigate Matthew chapter 24, we must keep in mind the book of Daniel. Why? Because Daniel tells us when the Messiah would appear. Why the book of Daniel? Because Jesus specifically said so. Time prophecies help us locate the time frame to look for the signs that Jesus mentions in Matthew 24, that would precede the appearance of the Messiah. Or, in other words, why the year 1844 is the year of the appearance of the Messiah. Jesus said this in verse 15 of Matthew 24, quote, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." End quote. We know that Jesus was pointing us to the book of Daniel for answers. One of the questions that Daniel answers is when the abomination causing desolation would end, meaning when the Messiah would appear. The answer to that is the year 1844 AD, or Common Era CE, the end point of the 2300 days prophecy in chapter 8, verses 13, 14, and 17 of the book of Daniel. Here is the text of these 3 verses from Daniel chapter 8, quote, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people? He said to me, It will take 2300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." And on to 17, "As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." End quote. Note that this means this time prophecy of the future to Daniel is to occur in the time of the end, meaning the end of the age, also known as the last days or the latter days. For Bible time prophecies, the very first and fundamental term in math to learn is that a day in prophecy equals a year to us humans on earth. To reiterate, a day in Bible verses that are time prophecies means that the prophecy is actually meaning a year on earth. Hebrew and Christian scholars agree on this. The Bible references that explain this, a day for a year, are listed on the screen. Daniel speaks of 2300 evenings and mornings. An evening and a morning equals 1 day. Thus, 2300 evenings and mornings are 2300 days in prophecy. And in Bible prophecies, that means that 2300 days really is foretelling 2300 years on planet Earth. The meaning of the terms reconsecrating the sanctuary and cleansing of the sanctuary is the coming of the Anointed One, the Messiah. And the reestablishment of the sanctuary means that a new covenant from and with God will be established, thus making a clean slate for humanity by the coming of a new revelation from God. This timeline shows that 2300 day prophecy, meaning 2300 years, but we don't have a starting point yet on the left, so we don't yet know the end point on the right, meaning when the Messiah would appear. How do we find out when this 2300 year period begins and ends? The starting point for counting these 2300 days or years to the second advent is the same year as the starting point for the coming of the first advent, foretold in the book of Daniel chapter 9. This was well documented in my video, Christ Has Returned, which is just a reflection of the studies of the prophecies by hundreds of Christians back in the early 1800s. That starting point is the year 457 BC. This is one of the many charts developed by the Seventh-day Adventists and others. This one shows the culmination of the 2300 days in the year 1844. There were numerous groups and individuals who became convinced of Christ's imminent return in the 1840s. Many also made charts similar to this one. When Christ did not come down out of the sky on a literal cloud and land at their feet, numerous people who were expectant of this and then greatly disappointed when it didn't happen. They then decided that Christ had returned, but only in heaven, not on earth, and they formed, some of these disappointed people, formed the Seventh-day Adventist sect of Christianity at that time. This is a diagram that I made for my video, Christ Has Returned, to illustrate the 2300-day prophecy endpoint in 1844. It is very similar to the one developed by the Seventh-day Adventists and others that showed the timeline for that 2300-year period. They both start at the left at 457 BC. The high, long blue arch is the 2300-year prophecy period of time. So both prophecies, the first and the second Advent prophecies, start at exactly the same beginning point, 457 BC. Now, the 70 weeks prophecy is actually in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel. Note that this 2300-year period ends in the year 1844, Common Era, again meaning that the Messiah would appear at that time, the year 1844. This is yet another one of the many charts that have been devised showing the long-known meaning of this prophecy, the 2300-day prophecy. Starting in the early 1800s, Christians the world over became energized by the discovery of the meaning of this 2300-day prophecy, and that it indicated the year 1844 was when Christ would return. Note that the purple arch on the left is the time period until the first advent of the Messiah, the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 that bore fruit when Jesus Christ walked the earth and taught his message of love and salvation. Now this timeline is a little different. It's showing 3 Bible time prophecies about when the Messiah would arrive, all foreseeing the year 1844 as the year. The green timeline at the bottom of the slide starts with 602 BC with the start of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 4 verse 25 about the length of King Nebuchadnezzar's punishment for being ungrateful to God. Note that the prophecy's hidden meaning is that this 7 times of punishment applies to humanity as a whole, not just punishment of this long dead King Nebuchadnezzar. The next prophecy, the one called the 2300 days prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, started the counting in year 457 BC and also ended in 1844, as we already discussed. The wide, shorter pink arrow shows the prophecy that is given in several Bible books and verses as 1260 days, it also a time, times, and half a time, and as 42 months. They all mean the same period of time, 1260 lunar years, starting in 622 Common Era from the Gregorian calendar, when Muhammad's faith, Islam, officially began with the beginning of the Islamic calendar and ending in, wouldn't you know, 1844 Common Era, the very year that the Bab made his proclamation as being a manifestation of God, and that he was the forerunner of one even greater than he, who he called him whom God shall make manifest, meaning Baha'u'llah. 1844 was also the very beginnings of Jews returning to their land of Israel with an awakening goal of forming their own nation once again. In that year, the Ottoman government restrictions of non-Muslims ended by edict of the courts, and all non-Muslims began to have equality before the law and freedom to worship their own faiths, including Judaism. Remember my mentioning once or twice during this that I have a video called Christ Has Returned. Well, this is how you can access it on YouTube. It explains several of these Bible time prophecies foretelling the appearance of the Messiah in 1844, and it is a must-watch video. It is true that the Bible does not give the day or the hour of his appearance, but it does give the year of his coming in several locations that were already mentioned. So watch this video. Go to my YouTube channel named Integral Destiny 9 that you see there. Integral Destiny 9 with a number 9 at the end. All one word with no spaces in between. You can also access my YouTube channel now by just putting in your browser search box the URL that's given at the bottom there, www.youtube.com/c/ and then Integral Destiny 9, my channel number. And then you have to look for the video by this name because this address here just gives how to get to my channel. You'll see lots of other videos there too. Just remember this year, 1844. It's from the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. The meaning of these time prophecies leading to the year 1844 was discovered by Christian scholars and prophecy buffs in the early 1800s. Their only fault, albeit a major fault, was they expected Jesus to come down out of the sky and land at their feet. When he did not, they didn't go out scouring the planet to find him. They just gave up. What folly! And it is truly a sad case. But we know what happened in 1844, don't we? The Bab made his declaration in May of 1844 that he was the promised one and the herald of another greater than he who would soon appear, the Messiah of the latter days, the Lord of hosts, the returned Christ in the station of the Father. Baha'u'llah made his great announcement in 1863. So this is our time frame leading up to and around the 1840s for these signs that Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24 should start making their appearances. I am introducing this timeline here just to make you aware that you will be seeing this timeline with various additions to it as we go through chapter 24 of Matthew. Next up is section 4, a short review of the text of Matthew chapter 24 verses 29 through and including 31. Matthew 24 verses 29 through 31, quote, "Immediately after the distress of those days the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other." End quote. Here are those same verses with some key phrases of prophecies highlighted. They will be listed separately on the next slide. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the heavenly bodies will be shaken, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, all the peoples of the earth will mourn, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, his angels with a loud trumpet call, gather his elect from the four winds. These key phrases are what we will be concentrating on in this video. A note here about that first sentence, quote, immediately after the distress of those days, end quote. In the King James Version, the first phrase of the verse is, quote, immediately after the tribulation of those days, etc. Note that the most obvious difference between the New International Version and the King James Version is that instead of the word distress, the King James Version uses the word tribulation. However, Baha'u'llah, the new Messiah, said that this passage would be more correct if it said, immediately after the oppression of those days, the sun will be darkened, etc. Here are the 4 central or most important key phrases. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. These prophecy elements can also be seen in Isaiah chapter 13, verses 9 and 10. Quote, behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel and full of wrath and fierce anger, to make the earth a desolation, and to destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light, the sun shall be darkened in its going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. End quote. You can see the same terms are used, the stars of heaven, plus it also mentions the constellations thereof, and the sun darkened, and the moon shall not shine. But of special importance at the very beginning of verse 9 of Isaiah chapter 13, it states, the day of the Lord cometh. The day of the Lord is the appearance of a manifestation of God, the Messiah, and Jesus said it would also be the end of his age, thus the beginning of a new age or era, and Daniel said that it would occur in the year 1844. We need to recognize the intersections of prophecies, especially intersections with time prophecies. Isaiah states these same events signal the day of the Lord, the coming of a manifestation of God. Daniel gave us the year of 1844 Common Era. Daniel chapter 4 verse 25 and verse 32 foretells the 7 times prophecy of 2,520 years before the end of a period of punishment, which ended in 1844. The Zohar tells us that 400 years before the start of the 7th millennium, meaning after the year 1840 Common Era, Jewish year 5601, the world would see the appearance of the Messiah. The Zohar is a Jewish mystical compilation widely read and accepted by those who are into Jewish mysticism. It is not accepted by all Jews, though. In these verses, Jesus is kind of giving a timeline, and I believe it fits in with the time prophecies in Daniel, the book of Revelation, and the 7 times prophecy in Daniel chapter 4, mentioned at the beginning of this video in section 3, and in my time prophecy video titled Christ Has Returned. So we start here with a timeline, the orange line in the middle. Time marches on from left to right. Matthew states that after the distress or oppression of those days, these events will occur. Now, there is no direct evidence that Jesus meant that each element of the prophecies happens in the order they are listed here. It's possible, but not definite. But for sure, he mentions that all these would happen before the end of the age. The end of the age is 1844 because the Bible said so, as we've discussed in section 3. So now we go through how these 3 central prophecy statements were fulfilled. First, I'll cover the possible literal fulfillment of these prophecies. Then I will review the spiritual or symbolic fulfillments of these same prophecies. So after the distress or oppression begins, Then all the below events happen, but we don't know if they happen in this chronological order or not. The sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from the sky, and heavenly bodies being shaken. Are these prophecies to be fulfilled literally or symbolically? These 4 prophecies are some of the more anticipated events of all the prophecies of the return of the Messiah. Are we to expect their literal fulfillment, symbolic fulfillment, or both? In this presentation, we will present evidence that there was fulfillment of both the literal and the symbolic interpretations of these prophecies before the proclamations of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, providing strong evidence that they are indeed the latest manifestations of God sent to guide humankind anew. You can then choose if you believe in the literal, the symbolic, both, or neither. We start with the literal fulfillment. Christians in both the USA and Europe noted the literal fulfillment of these prophecies in the late 1700s to early and mid-1800s. Combined with their discovery of the meaning of the 2300-day prophecy and the literal fulfillment of these 4 prophecies, a huge movement named the Great Awakening surged in the early 1800s. Part of that Great Awakening was what was called the Advent movement. Part of the Great Awakening included the expected return of Christ, the Messiah, to come down out of the sky and land at their feet in or near the year 1844. For your information, see the video titled Christ Has Returned by me. It's on my channel, Integral Destiny 9. It's a YouTube channel. And to learn more about it, see the bottom bullet mark there. We will start with these 2 elements of the prophecies. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light. On May 19, 1780, there was a widely noted dark day that was not due to an eclipse. The event was included in the 1883 edition of Webster's Unabridged Dictionary. Quote, "The dark day, May 19, 1780, so called on account of a remarkable darkness on that day extending all over New England. The true cause of this remarkable phenomenon is not known." End quote. The darkness started at about noon. It extended from New England down the eastern seacoast to northern New Jersey. Many observers at the time and scientists tracking eclipses since have documented that it was not an eclipse, lunar or solar. When the moon appeared later that day, it was the color of blood. About that dark day of 1780 in New England, a noted physicist, William R. Corliss, included the event in his book titled Unusual Natural Phenomena, Eyewitness Accounts of Nature's Greatest Mysteries. Published in 1983, it includes a description of this event from some eyewitnesses, one of which was Nathan Reed, a student at Harvard College who made these notes. 10:30 a.m., uncommon degree of darkness commenced. 11 a.m., darkness still increasing. Mr. Wigglesworth not able to read in a large Bible by a window. Fowls go to roost as at evening. At 12:21, darkness still increasing. Mr. W not able to read the running title of a large Bible. Candles are in common use. Frogs pipe and evening birds sing. The Hartford, Connecticut legislature was in session that day. This entry into the journal of the legislature, quote, "None could see to read or write in the house, or even at a window. At 11 o'clock adjourned the house till 2 o'clock." End quote. Some remarks were recorded wondering if it was the day of judgment. There is another prophecy about the time of the end, about a dark day to come, that intersects here, from the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse 31, quote, The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come." End quote. From the context of some other Bible verses, we know that the term "day of the Lord" means the coming of a prophet or manifestation of God. We may wonder what the possible cause or causes there were for this event and similar ones. Mr. Corliss, a physicist, believes that the following are some possible causes for such events: forest fires, volcanic activity, intense storms, stratospheric or extraterrestrial cloud of obscuring matter, such as an asteroid belt. In Mr. Corliss's book, he describes several other dark days which have been reported, as you see here in this table. Some with known causes, others suspected, and some absolutely unknown cause. Now, Jesus did not say that the dark day he foretold would be due to known or unknown causes. There's nothing to preclude any of these from being the dark day he spoke of, or perhaps none of them are. Note that the Tambora volcanic explosion in 1815, just 2 years before the birth of Baha'u'llah and 4 years before the birth of the Bab, is one of the events causing dark days, and will also be mentioned shortly when we speak of Jesus foretelling earthquakes. Also note that Jesus did not limit the dark day to any particular geographical area, if we take this prophecy literally. It's kind of odd that Mr. Corliss had no examples of dark days after 1886 in his book, which was first published in 1983. He mentions that there have been dark days, but he thinks nowadays they are dismissed because people generally surmise that they are due to pollution or smoke. We certainly have seen such conditions lately with so many forest fires in many areas of our globe, apparently due to or contributed to by climate change. This map shows the location of the Tambora volcano in Indonesia, and you can also see where the ash cloud extended to as a result of the explosion of this volcano, up through the Middle East, into Russia even, Europe, across the Atlantic Ocean to even parts of the east coast of the North American continent. And this ash cloud caused some dark days, at least in some areas, some darkened days. Note that the ash lingered in the atmosphere so long that the following summer season in Europe in 1816 was called the Year Without Summer because of the temperature effects of the climate for the entire summer. It also caused crop failures, famines, an increase in cholera cases, and even emigration changes. The blast of the explosion was reportedly heard up to 1,400 miles away. Could that blast have been the trumpet blast announcing the coming of a manifestation of God appearing on the planet? Why not? This illustration shows some of the effects of the Tambora volcano explosion in 1815. You can pause the video and read some of the notes if you wish. But what about the moon being darkened too? Well, if the sun is obscured and you cannot see the sun due to whatever caused the dark day, you likely would not be able to see the moon either. Remember, the moon is visible because the sun's rays are reflected from its surface. Presumably, if the sun's rays cannot reach the earth, it is possible that the sun's rays may not be reflected off the moon as well. Thus, the sun being darkened to our eyesight, it could possibly cause the moon to be darkened too. Plus, in some of these instances, it was described that the moon turned to the color of blood, meaning that it was darkened. We will count both the darkening of the sun and the moon, that's the turning the color of blood, thus not giving off its light, prophecies as being literally fulfilled before 1844. Next, we move on to the third part of verse 29. The stars will fall from the sky. We know now what they did not know in the time of Jesus, that the stars that are seen in the sky are enormously larger than our planet. I'm sure that Jesus knew that, but the people he was talking to at the time and many centuries thereafter would not have any conception of that. We know that if the stars in the heavens would fall to earth, it would be like 1,000 million Himalayan mountains falling on a mustard seed. Physically impossible. In order to take a literal interpretation of this prophecy, we will have to restrict our definition of a star to things like meteors, comets, and asteroids, and other such objects out there. Any physical body not a star, sun, or moon that would not obliterate our planet should it fall to the surface of the earth. It would have to be the size limit. The stars will fall from the sky. Well, that was fulfilled by the star fall of 1833. This well-documented event was considered the most extensive falling star event ever recorded. An estimate of the rate of star fall, meteors, was in excess of 34,640 per hour. This is a 19th century depiction of the star fall of 1833. Now there was another star fall in 1866, just after the proclamation by Baha'u'llah that he is the Messiah of the latter days. It was of a far less intensity than the 1833 event, which happened before the declaration of the Bab. So the 1833 event announced the coming of the Bab. The 1866 event occurred around the time that Baha'u'llah declared his being the Messiah, and that was his announcement there. As reported in the book by William Sears titled Thief in the Night, the American Journal of Science gave this report about the starfall of 1833. Quote, "Though there was no moon, when we first observed them, their brilliancy was so great that we could at times read common-sized print without much difficulty, and the light which they afforded was much whiter than that of the moon in the clearest and coldest night, when the ground is covered with snow." End quote. Baha'u'llah, in his book titled Epistle to the Son of Wolf, confirmed that the starfall of 1866 did fulfill the Bible prophecies about the stars falling. Quote, "Have the stars fallen? Say, yea, when he who is the self-subsisting dwelt in the land of mystery," meaning Adrianople. "Take heed, ye who are endued with discernment." End quote. Baha'u'llah was speaking of the starfall of 1866, since that was when he was living in exile in the city of Adrianople. We will count the stars falling from the sky prophecies as being literally fulfilled. So we have shown how numbers 1 through 3 have been literally fulfilled. So on to number 4, the heavenly bodies will be shaken. What kinds of heavenly bodies could this be talking about? Here are some. Our sun and other stars, solar systems, galaxies, our moon, other planets and their moons, comets, asteroids, meteors, and other unknown heavenly objects. However, there are some problems here. Number 1, how could a heavenly body be shaken? Or the powers of heavens be shaken? Number 2, the shaking of a heavenly body. How would it affect us here on earth so that we would know it was a sign that the Messiah was soon to come? How would we know if a heavenly body shakes? And what is a power of the heavens? Much more than one of them. Note that powers and heavens are plural. Number 3, this event or events would have to occur sometime just before, during, or shortly after the arrival of the Messiah and or his herald, meaning shortly before, during, or after 1844 through the year 1863. Remember, the year 1844, foretold by Daniel in chapter 8 of that book, is definitely the time period for such signs to appear, if those signs are to be materially or literally manifested in the world. We will start with looking at that timeline to help us situate ourselves in time. Remember, this timeline is not to exact scale. The year 1844 is when the book of Daniel told us that the Messiah would appear. Therefore, it seems logical that the occurrence of an event or events wherein a heavenly body or bodies are shaken would occur in the window of time demarcated by this red-bordered green background period of time. Recall that Daniel's prophecy of the year 1844 was fulfilled when the Bab, the herald or Elijah figure to the Messiah, made his declaration in May of 1844 in Shiraz, Persia. The Bab foretold the coming of him whom God shall make manifest within 9 to 19 years from his time. Then, in April of 1863, Baha'u'llah made his proclamation that he was the Messiah, the person foretold in all the sacred scriptures of the past, and in fulfillment of the Bab's prophecy of the coming of him whom God shall make manifest. Knowing those dates will help us try to pinpoint an event or events that may have literally fulfilled this prophecy in Matthew 24. I've not been able to find a direct confirmation of proposed literal events in my studies of Bible prophecy fulfillment from either a Christian or Baha'i reference, specific on either the NIV's, the New International Version of the Bible's translation of the short phrase, heavenly bodies shall be shaken, or from the King James translation, the powers of earth shall be shaken. We did, of course, from the other 3 elements of verse 29, fulfillment on the stars falling and the moon not giving its light. We do have that from both the Christian and Baha'i viewpoints. However, this last element, just that heavenly bodies shall be shaken, is what I'm talking about here. It does, to my mind, point out one of the shortcomings of the literal-only method of the interpretation of Bible prophecy fulfillment. Wasn't that one of the chief reasons for the Jews to have rejected Christ, after all, that he didn't fulfill all prophecies literally? So I decided to do some research to see if there may be some previously overlooked events that may apply to this small clause in the prophecies. I reviewed these events for something that could literally shake us here on earth. The only one of these that could qualify as a little known but a rather earth-shaking event. Number 4, the Carrington event of 1859. The 1859 Carrington event. On September 1st, 1859, astronomer Richard Carrington in London, England, observed one of the largest solar flares, that's a coronal mass ejection, ever recorded. In fact, the first one recorded as well. It is also called the solar storm of 1859. For the following 2 or 3 days afterwards, the solar wind that apparently resulted from or was augmented by this solar flare hit the Earth, causing extensive damage. Telegraph systems all over North America and Europe failed. Telegraph pylons threw sparks, shocking the operators. Telegraph paper even caught on fire. Remember, in the year 1859,
Telegraph systems were about the only electrical systems in the world. There were no interconnected electrical power systems, no phone systems, no internet back then. If a solar storm event of this magnitude were to happen today, the damage to electrical, phone, and internet systems would be in the multi-trillions of dollars. That's with a T, trillions of dollars.
Another report regarding the effects of the Carrington event, quote, "Just before dawn the next day, skies all over the planet Earth erupted in red, green, and purple auroras so brilliant that newspapers could be read as easily as in daylight. Indeed, stunning auroras pulsated even at near tropical latitudes over Cuba, the Bahamas, Jamaica, El Salvador, and Hawaii." End quote. Here is a more recent view of a solar flare recorded in March of 2010. Note the inset in the upper left corner showing the approximate size of our planet Earth compared to this solar flare. Apparently, the 1859 eruption was larger than this one. According to the Center for Science Education, quote, "Solar flares emit huge bursts of electromagnetic radiation, including X-rays, ultraviolet radiation, visible light, and radio waves. The energy emitted by a solar flare is more than 1,000,000 times greater than the energy from a volcanic explosion on Earth." End quote. This is that timeline again, this time with the Carrington event of 1859, the pink vertical line between 1844 and 1863, added to it. It well could have been one of the signs of the appearance of the Messiah, meaning the proclamation in April of 1863 by Baha'u'llah that he is the long-awaited Messiah of the latter days. You may ask, but what about the King James Version's phrasing, "The powers of the heavens shall be shaken"? Such a massive electromagnetic event was definitely a power of the heavens, and it did shake things up in a sense. You decide. Some Bible prophecy buffs have taken this to mean that terrible earthquakes would happen, especially since the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 12 foretells, quote, "I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red." End quote. Basically, Matthew chapter 24, verse 29 is the same prophecy as the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 12. However, instead of Matthew's, "the heavenly bodies will be shaken," Revelation prophesies that a great earthquake will happen. That is, if you take all these prophecies as foretelling literal material events. Here are some additional prophecies of earthquakes from the New Testament. Luke chapter 21 verse 10, Mark chapter 13 verse 8, Matthew chapter 24 verse 7 speaks of earthquakes occurring at the time of the end of the age that Jesus spoke of. Revelation chapter 8 verse 5 mentions an earthquake, and Revelation chapter 11 verse 19 and chapter 16 verse 18 also do. Note, just because they all mention an earthquake, it does not mean that it is the same earthquake, literally or symbolically. Then we come to the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. The Christians of the late 1700s and the early and mid-1800s in both Europe and North America viewed this great earthquake that devastated Lisbon, Portugal, as the earthquake of Bible prophecy. My own thoughts are, if there was a literal fulfillment of a great earthquake, a far more likely earth-shaking event fulfilling this prophecy of an earthquake would have been the tremendous explosion of a stratovolcano in 1815 in Indonesia, Mount Tambora. It was mentioned previously in this video.
On April 5th, 1815, Tambora exploded. The explosion was heard up to 1,400 miles away. A larger explosion occurred on April 10th, 1815, that ejected a huge amount of lava and ash. The explosive eruption on April 10 was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history, even more powerful than the famous eruption of Krakatoa many years later in 1883. Here is a comparison of the explosive power of the three largest volcanic explosions since 1800, although I'm not sure where Tonga, the latest one we just had recently, how that would fit in here. I'm sure it would be less than Tambora. So Tambora is rated as a 7 in a logarithmic scale of 0 to 8 of volcanic eruptions. That's the bar at the far right. That was in 1815. Krakatoa, rated as a 6 on this scale, that's in the middle of the graph, was in 1883. Mount St. Helens, at the left, it was rated a 5 on the scale. It occurred in 1980. The scale used to rate the power of a volcanic eruption goes from 0 to 8. It is a logarithmic scale, which means that a magnitude 7 eruption is 10 times more powerful than an eruption at level 6. Then an 8-rated eruption is 10 times more powerful than a 7. The release of sulfur and particulate matter into the stratosphere caused global weather disruption. It caused the year without summer in the following year of 1816 in the northern hemisphere. Temperatures were reduced like 0.7 degrees to 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Now this is my choice as the most probable literal fulfillment of this prophecy because the Messiah of the Second Advent, Baha'u'llah, was born in 1817 and his forerunner, the Bab, was born in 1819. This explosion in 1815 announced their upcoming births. With Daniel's prophecy of the end of the age being fulfilled in 1844 by the Bab's proclamation, this monumental explosive eruption in 1815 would definitely qualify. You've seen this map before when we reviewed the dark days when the sun and moon did not give off their light. This map shows the extent of that ash cloud from the Mount Tambora explosions. The blast of the explosion was reportedly heard up to 1,400 miles away. Could that blast have been the trumpet blast announcing the coming of a manifestation or prophet of God appearing on the planet? Maybe so. Then we have the New Madrid earthquakes, plural, of the years 1811 and 1812. New Madrid is at the southeastern border of the state of Missouri and western Tennessee and Kentucky, as you can see on this map of the events. The initial shock on December 16, 1811, was estimated to be about 7.5 on the current scale. Aftershocks in January and February of 1812 were estimated to be at 7.3 and 7.5 respectively. There were hundreds of other aftershocks in the area of lesser degree. When the December 16, 1811 earthquake occurred, people as far away as New York and North Carolina felt the shaking. And there was an actual earthquake that happened a couple years after the martyrdom of the Bab. He was shot by a firing squad at the orders of the Persian king. When the earthquake occurred, many of those who were on that same firing squad were killed during this earthquake. The earthquake was the one prophesied in the book of Revelation, chapter 11, verse 13, as follows. And the quote, and in the same hour there was a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000. End quote. And the explanation from the writings of the Baha'i faith follow, quote, this earthquake occurred in Shiraz after the martyrdom of the Bab. The city was in a turmoil, and many people were destroyed. Great agitation also took place through diseases, cholera, dearth, scarcity, famine, and afflictions, the like of which had never been known." End quote. This is a very congested timeline here. I don't think I really need to say that. You can see it for yourself. Trying to pack in a lot of events in a fairly short period of time, about 100 years, into this tiny space is quite a challenge. I've included these earthquake, shaking, and heavenly events on our timeline. Note that the birthdays of Baha'u'llah in 1817 and the Bab's in 1819 are on the left side of the timeline, and their declaration dates are demarcated by the bright light blue vertical line, thick near the middle, labeled 1844. That's the Bab's declaration year. And Baha'u'llah's in the thick purple vertical line labeled 1863 to the right of it. Comets are shown in red font in the legend and red vertical lines on the timeline. Note that the label of great, as in the Great Comet of 1843, depends on several factors by the astronomers who first saw it. There apparently are no hard and fast rules delineating when a comet is deemed as great or not. First, in the legend on the bottom is A. There was the dark day of 1780. B is the late 1811, early 1812 New Madrid earthquakes. C, the Great Comet of 1811. D, 1815 Mount Tambora eruptions and the dark days that lasted in the Middle East up into Europe and caused the year without summer in the following year of 1816. E, the Great Comet of 1823. F, the 1833 Starfall meteor shower. 1835 Halley Comet is G. H, the Great Comet of 1843. I, 1852's Biela's Comet. It was remarkable because it split into two segments. J, 1857 Dark Day in Amsterdam, Holland. K, 1858 the Comet Donati. L, 1859 the Carrington event, solar flare. M, 1860 Dark Day in Brazil. N, 1861 Great Comet of 1861. O, the Comet C, 1861 G1 Thatcher. P, Comet 109P Swift-Tuttle. It was discovered in 1862. Q, 1866 Starfall meteor shower. R, 1874 another comet. S, 1880 a great comet. T, 1881 another great comet. U, 1882 great comet. V, 1883 Krakatoa volcano explodes. W, 1886 dark day of Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And X, 1887 Great Comet. Note that Baha'u'llah left this physical existence in the year 1892, and the Bab was martyred in 1850. These shaking events occurred in monumental, history-making, literal ways, thus most definitely literally fulfilled in the timeline of the Book of Daniel, meaning around the year 1844. Some events occurred before, during, or after the births of the Bab or Baha'u'llah, and others occurred before, during, and shortly after their declarations. Thus, these were literally fulfilled. Okay, so these were literally fulfilled, to my way of thinking, before or shortly after a significant event in the lives of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, or in their faith, the Baha'i faith. But in our more scientifically advanced time, We can list hundreds of events in the heavens, meaning in our solar system or other countless solar systems. How can we possibly think that each and every such event out there has some significant meaning here on our teeny tiny planet called Earth? Just something to think about for our future visits of God's messengers. Will we be looking at the literal heavens for signs of their coming when we know so many of such events occur? How would we know what's what?
Literal fulfillment of the 4 key phrases of these prophecies has been proven, at least to my satisfaction. You will need to decide for yourself. Onward.
Now, on to showing the spiritual, also known as symbolic, fulfillment of these 4 prophecies that indicate the appearance of the expected Messiah. The fulfillment of them in symbolic, meaning spiritually significant ways, is far more important and meaningful. Hopefully you will soon understand why I make that claim, and maybe you'll even agree with me.
Here are those 4 elements of the prophecy distilled out again. You may be wondering, how could these possibly be symbolic in meaning? If you remember our discussion of terms in section 2, you may have an inkling of their meanings.
What does darkened mean, if not a literal darkening of the sun and moon? This explanation is again from the Messiah of this age, from the writings of Baha'u'llah, quote, "Hence it is clear and manifest that by the words, 'The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven,' is intended the waywardness of the divines," that's religious leaders, "and the annulment of laws firmly established by divine revelation, all of which, in symbolic language, have been foreshadowed by the manifestation of God." End quote. What does it mean that the laws of the previous dispensation were annulled? Another quote from Baha'u'llah, quote, "It is unquestionable that in every succeeding revelation, the sun and moon of the teachings, laws, commandments, and prohibitions which have been established in the preceding dispensation, and which have been overshadowed the people of that age, become darkened, that is, are exhausted and cease to exert their influence," meaning they do not give their light any longer. End quote. Furthermore, Baha'u'llah goes on to speak of the followers of all the existing religions on earth when his revelation commenced, quote, "They, the followers of the past faiths, still have not awakened to perceive that all the signs foretold have been made manifest, that the promised sun hath risen above the horizon of divine revelation, and that the sun and moon of the teachings, the laws, and the learning of a former dispensation have darkened and set." End quote. Then concerning number 3, the stars will fall from the sky. Baha'u'llah, the Messiah of the Second Advent, speaks of his contact with the supreme religious leaders of his time. That's the Persian clerics. Quote, "When I came unto them in my majesty, however, they turned aside from me. They verily are of the fallen." This is what the Spirit, Jesus, prophesied when he came with the truth, and the Jewish doctors cavilled at him until they committed what made the Holy Spirit to lament, and the eyes of such as enjoy near access to God to weep. End quote. The word cavilled, by the way, means that the Jewish priests made trivial, petty, unnecessary objections to Jesus, rather than have important or meaningful concerns. Furthermore, this explanation of the meaning of falling stars, quote, "In another sense, by these terms, the sun, the moon, the stars, is intended the divines of the former dispensation, who live in the days of the subsequent revelations, and who hold the reins of religion in their grasp. If these divines be illumined by the light of the latter revelation, they will be acceptable unto God, and will shine with a light everlasting. Otherwise, meaning they do not accept the new manifestation and revelation from God, they will be declared as darkened, even though to outward seeming they be leaders of men, inasmuch as belief and unbelief, guidance and error, felicity and misery, light and darkness, are all dependent upon the sanction of Him who is the day star of truth." End quote. What about the darkening of the divines, the clergy? When the Bab declared his revelation in Persia, many tens of thousands of people, possibly hundreds of thousands, came to believe in him as the fulfillment of prophecy. This included mostly Muslims, but also some Persian Jews and Zoroastrians. A number of Muslim mullahs, that's the clergy in Islam, the predominant religion in Persia, also came to believe in his cause. But many of the Muslim clergy and most of the Islamic leadership of Shia Islam, that's the sect that's most predominant in Persia, modern Iran, rejected his claim of being the Mahdi, the promised one of Islam, and eventually pushed the Persian king to put him to death, which occurred in July of 1850. After the martyrdom of the Bab in 1850, over 20,000 of his followers were also killed, partially due to the instigation of the Muslim clergy in Persia. This government and clergy combination then perpetuated persecution of Baha'u'llah, who they first imprisoned in an underground dungeon, then had exiled to Baghdad, which is outside of Persia and inside the borders of the Ottoman Empire, governed by the Sultan, who was based in Turkey. The clergy of Sunni Islam and the Ottoman Empire then together perpetuated this exile and imprisonment of Baha'u'llah, members of his family and followers. The persecution of the members of the Baha'i faith established by the Bab and Baha'u'llah continues to this day, especially in Iran, the modern name of Persia. What about the clergy and religious leaders of other faiths? Have they fallen? Many have been very open and accepting, especially within multi-faith or interfaith efforts, but few, if ever, look into the beliefs of the faith, especially regarding the Baha'i faith being the fulfillment of the prophecies of their own faiths, the coming of a Savior for their own faiths, especially as the return of Christ. Some clergy and religious leaders of other faiths are openly hostile or dismissive because they are not open to alternative interpretations of the prophecies of their own faiths, just like the Pharisees at the appearance of Jesus. So, because they deny the new manifestation of God, they too have fallen and are darkened. The consequences of their being fallen is that they and the institutions of their faith no longer have the divine guidance of God. They've shut the door in His face, so to speak. This is also true because the Baha'i faith established by the new Messiah has no clergy at all. Baha'u'llah has revealed that humanity has achieved the spiritual maturity that a democratically elected hierarchy of institutions is able to guide the Baha'i faith into the new age. A clergy is no longer necessary. The longer the people of the world continue to ignore or reject the teachings of the latest manifestations of God, the Bab and Baha'u'llah, the worse their faiths and world conditions will fare. More divisions within and between the faiths will occur, falling away of followers, corruption of the pure faith of the original faiths that resulted from their initial teachings of their prophet. Misbehavior of the clergy and followers of the faith will occur. Regarding those clerics and divines, more from Baha'u'llah, quote, "It is clear and evident that whenever the manifestations of holiness were revealed, the divines or clerics of their day have hindered the people from attaining unto the way of truth. To this testify the records of all the scriptures and heavenly books. Not one prophet of God was made manifest who did not fall a victim to the relentless hate, to the denunciation, denial, and execration of the clerics of his day." End quote. And this from the writings of Baha'u'llah on the subject of foolish leaders. Quote, "And yet, in spite of all these manifold revelations of divine knowledge which have encompassed the world, they, the foolish leaders, still vainly imagine the door of knowledge to be closed and the showers of mercy to be stilled. Clinging unto idle fancy, they have strayed far from the Urvatul Vuthka, that's the sure handle, of divine knowledge. Their hearts seem not to be inclined to knowledge, and the door thereof, neither think they of its manifestations, inasmuch as in idle fancy they have found the door that leadeth unto earthly riches, whereas in the manifestation of the revealer of knowledge they find naught but the call to self-sacrifice. They therefore naturally hold fast unto the former, and flee from the latter." Just to make sure you are understanding this rather convoluted paragraph, I've summarized it here. The last statement stated, "They therefore naturally hold fast unto the former, and flee from the latter." To clarify what the former and the latter are, I've separated them here. The former statements that the foolish leaders hold fast to are in the column on the left. That is, the foolish leaders vainly imagine the door of knowledge to be closed, and the showers of mercy to be stilled. They cling to idle fancy. They have strayed far from the sure handle of divine knowledge. Their hearts seem not to be inclined to knowledge and the door thereof, neither think they of its manifestations, inasmuch as idle fancy they have found the door that leadeth unto earthly riches. And the latter statement is the manifestation of the revealer of knowledge, the manifestation of God. They, the foolish leaders, find not but the call to self-sacrifice, from which the foolish leaders flee, and that is what's in the latter category. And that's what they flee from, is this manifestation of the revealer of knowledge. In other words, they reject the divine manifestation of God and reject the call to self-sacrifice. The foolish leaders do not wish to have to sacrifice anything for God or anyone else. So, were these prophecies fulfilled spiritually or symbolically rather than strictly literally? I think it's been shown that spiritually the sun was darkened, and the moon failed to show its light. The stars of heaven did fall to earth, the worldly over the heavenly. It is my opinion that these 3 out of the 4 elements of this verse 29 prophecy have indeed been fulfilled. And this is the last of the 4. The heavenly bodies will be shaken. But first we need to explore the possible answers to the question, what are heavenly bodies, and how can the prophecy, the heavenly bodies will be shaken, be explained in a spiritual or symbolic way? The authoritative writings of the Baha'i faith explain that, quote, "All the prophets, meaning the manifestations of God, are lights. They only differ in degree. They shine like brilliant heavenly bodies. Each have their appointed place and time of ascension. Some are like lamps, some like the moon, some like distant stars, and a few are like the sun, shining from one end of the earth to the other. All have the same light to give, yet they are different in degree." End quote. The question then becomes, how will they be shaken? Well, it's not the actual prophets or manifestations of God of the past that are shaken. They are gone from the earthly scene, obviously, but rather what will be shaken are their faiths, in particular the institutions and power structures of the existing faiths, the spiritual laws of the former dispensations, which are now abrogated by the appearance of the new manifestation of God, and traditions that have grown from the above, practice, rituals, and other things like marriage and divorce laws, etc., may be changed by the newest manifestation of God. Islam, in particular, has been shaken. This is because they were the first persecutors of the new manifestations of God, the Bab and Baha'u'llah and their followers, because that's where the Bab and Baha'u'llah first revealed their missions. Their persecution of the followers of the Baha'i faith continues to this very day. Islam has suffered a whole lot of shaking in the last few centuries, including the following: loss of power of the Islamic institutions and clergy. In the Sunni branch, the diminishing and eventual disappearance of the Caliphate, the supreme leadership of the Sunni sect of Islam, never to be reestablished. And in the Shia branch, first the secularization of Iran cut the power of the Shia branch of Islam in the 1900s up to the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Then, since that revolution, the growing disenchantment, if not disgust, of the Iranian people for the religious leaders. The clergy may still have power, but not the respect and regard of their people. There are earthquakes in religion. There are increasing numbers of sects and divisions in the existing faiths. There's corruption of the clergy becoming involved in politics and the trappings of power wielding, the dimming of the spiritual light of faith in the believers of all the faiths, an increasingly secular world, and the injection of human beliefs and misunderstandings counter to the original teachings of the pure faiths in all the existing faiths. Many, but not all, members of the existing faiths appear to be causing increasing division and animosity between humans on our one and only planet instead of trying to bring us together. All the major faiths have their own version of the Golden Rule, but so many of their followers have forgotten it, indeed preach and or act contrary to that spiritual law of God. I do have a video on the Golden Rule, and it's titled The Golden Rule, It's the Law. You can find it on my video channel on YouTube. My channel name is Integral Destiny 9. At last, we've covered both the literal and the symbolic meanings of verse 29 and how it's been fulfilled in both ways. So we can move on to verse 30. Verse 30, quote, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory."
Again, for verses 30 and 31, just as with verse 29, the fulfillment of the prophecies therein may be literal or spiritual or possibly both in nature.
Note that after all the events of verse 29 occurred, then will appear, and it goes on from there. So we now know that there's a sequence of events here. Note that there are two phases of this prophecy that will occur after all that distress or oppression. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. First, let's examine the heavenly terms that are being used, such as those in this list. Will appear the sign of, Son of Man, in heaven, clouds of heaven, with power and great glory. We'll start with the terms in heaven and Son of Man. This verse is from the book of John, chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. Note that Jesus is speaking here. Quote, "I have spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? No one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man." End quote. Note that some Bible versions state man who is in heaven. The Messiah, the Divine Spirit, is the Son of Man. Now for John chapter 6 verse 38, and Jesus is speaking here, quote, "For I have come down from heaven, not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me." End quote. Again, Jesus stated that he came down from heaven. In this case, the people who knew his parents and him as a child scoffed because they knew he was born to Mary and did not come from an unknown place called heaven. And he definitely did not come down out of the sky. Jesus is saying that he, the Messiah, the Son of Man, came from heaven, although we all know the story of how he was born to Mary. So it must be something other than his physical body that came from heaven, or down from heaven in some translations, or in Luke or Mark. Another verse that Jesus spoke, John chapter 4 verse 24, again quoting Jesus, "God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." End quote. So remember, God is a spirit, not material. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 4, and remember Paul is the author of these letters, quote, "The light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." End quote. Jesus the Christ was the image of God. Let's take a journey down a logical path. God is a spirit, per the Bible verse we reviewed. Jesus Christ is the image of God, and the Bible also directly refers to him as the Spirit. Therefore, Christ, the Messiah, is a spirit. His spirit is the image of God, not his physical body. His spirit is what came from heaven, a place of the spirit, not from a physical place on or above the earth. That is how Jesus the Christ can be on earth and in heaven at the same time. He was speaking not of the location of his body, but rather the location or state of his spirit. The Son of Man will appear from heaven. Just as Jesus the Christ came from heaven in the first advent, he would come from heaven in the second advent. In other words, the returned Christ Spirit would return as a spirit from God, the image of God, in or associated with a human physical body, but it would be another human body, not the former body of Jesus, and he would have a new name. Regarding the phrase, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven," it means that a sign will signal the coming of the Messiah returned, but this sign would be in heaven. So we will have to discuss what a possible sign might be, and included in that, what does "in heaven" mean? And whether this sign of his coming in the second advent will be literally a sign of in the literal heaven, meaning in the sky, or will this sign be symbolic or spiritual in nature, or both? What were the signs before the appearance of Jesus the Christ, you might ask? Actually, there were both literal and symbolic signs to signal that the Messiah would soon appear, for those who could see the signs of the times. In the column on the left, the literal sign in the sky, the famous Star of Bethlehem in the sky around the time when Jesus was born. And then, the symbolic sign of the times in the column on the right, the appearance of the prophesied Elijah figure, who was John the Baptist, who announced the imminent appearance of the Messiah, who was Jesus in this case. Just a reminder, the Bab, the Elijah figure of the returned Messiah, has already come. In 1844, he announced his identity and station as the forerunner of the soon-to-appear Messiah. Note, the Bab was an independent manifestation of God, too. He even revealed his own holy book. His followers were called Babis. The singular is Babi. And those Babis later became Baha'is when Baha'u'llah revealed that he was the Messiah. If the Bob was a manifestation of God, and the Lamb prophesied in the book of Revelation, by the way, what were the signs of his appearance?
You've seen this timeline before. The events listed at the bottom are entered on the timeline at the top. Comets, the most commonly thought of signs of the heavens that one might expect from what the prophecy states, are shown as red vertical lines and letters on the timeline and in the red font on the legend. Starfalls are noted in blue font in the legend. This is not an exhaustive list of comets during this period. The more I dived into researching the topic, the more comets I ran into. Not literally, of course. There are some comets during this period that I have not listed here. There were some comets discovered in the 1800s that then were never seen again. There may well have been many that were never put on the record. But here's what I've noted of potential signs in the heavens foretelling the appearances of the Bab and or Baha'u'llah. I won't read this long list to you. Pause the video if you want to review the specific events more closely. Again, comets are the red entries, starfalls are blue. The Carrington event is L on the timeline. The explosion of the Tambora volcano is D, as in dog. Note that the Bab was martyred in July of 1850, and Baha'u'llah had his vision, his revelation experience in late 1852, wherein he was told in a heavenly vision that he was the one the Bab foretold as being him whom God shall make manifest, meaning the Messiah of the latter days. The signs of Matthew chapter 24, the darkening of the sun and moon, falling stars, literally the starfall of 1833, etc., that were already discussed earlier in this presentation were some of these literal heavenly signs. And the Great Comet of 1843, which was a supremely unique comet in that it was so bright that it was seen in the daytime and it had an enormous tail. It was first seen in February of 1843 and for 5 weeks until April 8, 1843. The Bab made his proclamation in May of 1844, if you recall. And remember, the Bab's announcement was also the announcement of the coming of the Messiah of the latter days, because that's what the Bab said he was sent to do, to let people know the Messiah would shortly appear. Another comet, Biela's comet. It became one of the most unique comets ever observed. It split into 2 comets sometime between 1842 and 1845. It reappeared in 1852 at the time that the Messiah, Baha'u'llah, was thrown into prison because he was then a follower of the Bab, his forerunner, who had been martyred in July of 1850. Baha'u'llah received his revelation from God while he was in that prison in late 1852, when Biela's comet was noted as having divided into 2. The starfall of 1833 was a super-intensive meteor shower and was one of the signs many Christians touted as a sign of the return of Christ, adding to the fervor of the Adventist movement happening in Europe and the USA. Then the starfall of 1866, which was a bit less intensive than the 1833 event, which Baha'u'llah himself said was a sign of his coming, the one in 1866. There have been some theories presented that the Star of Bethlehem was really a great conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn, like 4 to 6 years before the birth of Jesus, giving the Magi some time to get to Bethlehem from their home country. Note that this is a theory and not absolutely proven to be the case. What about one or more of these Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions occurring around 1844 or 1863? So I did some investigation to find out if there were any.
There were 5 great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in the 1800s. On July 16, 1802, June 18, 1821, January 26, 1842, October 20, 1861, April 17, 1881. Obviously, the dates January of 1842, 16 months before the advent of the Bob, and October 20th, 1861, a year and a half before the great announcement by Baha'u'llah in April of 1863, would both easily fit the scenario of these conjunctions being those signs in the heavens signaling the advent of the Messiah foretold by Jesus. Therefore, as far as literal fulfillment of this clause of verse 30, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, this has been fulfilled in several different ways. Done. Next, how this part of verse 30 was fulfilled spiritually or symbolically as opposed to literal fulfillment. What were the heavenly signs of the forerunner's coming? Before the appearance of the Bab, the gate, there were 2 men who, in succession, proclaimed the imminent appearance of the promised one of Islam, the Mahdi, who is also the foretold Elijah figure who would come before the Messiah to the Jews and Christians. These persons were Sheikh Ahmad, he was born in 1753 and died in 1834. Then Syed Kazim, Ahmad's successor, who died in 1843. One of the last actions of Syed Kazim before he died in 1843 was that he sent some of his students out on a quest to find the Promised One. One of these students did find the Promised One. He was the first person to whom the Bab made his first proclamation of being the Promised One, the Mahdi, the forerunner of the Messiah. Note that the Bab is also the Lamb prophesied in the book of Revelation. These were the signs of the appearance of the Bab to announce his coming. The literal signs on the left in the blue column and the spiritual signs from heaven are in the column on the right, the green column. The literal signs you can see on the left, the star fall of 1833, then the 1815 explosion of Mount Tambora. Note that the Tambora volcano eruption signals both the Bab and Baha'u'llah's appearances, as does the Great Comet of 1843. Anything literal or symbolic that signals the appearance of the Bab would signal the coming of Baha'u'llah too, since the Bab appeared as the Elijah figure for Baha'u'llah's revelation. Then there's the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in January of 1842. Now on the right are the spiritual or symbolic signs from heaven. Those were the appearances of and the teachings about the imminent coming of the Promised One, proclaimed for at least 10 years in advance of the coming of the Bab by Sheikh Ahmad, Syed Kazim, and their students who went out in search of the Promised One. And these are the heavenly signs to announce the coming of Baha'u'llah. In the column on the left are some of the literal signs in the heavens of the coming of the Messiah, Baha'u'llah. The 1815 eruption and its effects from the explosion of Mount Tambora, which also caused the dark days, and which occurred 2 years before the birth of Baha'u'llah and about 4 years before the birth of the Bab. The Great Comet of 1843, it was a heavenly sign of the coming of the Bab. As I mentioned, since the Bab was the herald of Baha'u'llah, it was also a heavenly sign of the coming of Baha'u'llah too. Biela's Comet of 1852, that was the comet that split into 2 parts, and its splitting into 2 was especially symbolic of the 2 divine beings that had appeared on earth, the Bab, who had already been martyred in 1850, and the fact that Baha'u'llah's revelation was made known to him in late 1852. thus being the second part of the comet in symbolism, that is. The conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in October 1861, Baha'u'llah publicly declared his divine identity and mission in April of 1863. This conjunction was the literal sign of his coming. Then the Great Comet of 1861. This comet and the two following, occurring in 1861 and 62, could be the heavenly signs of this historic and much anticipated public declaration of the Messiah of the latter days. Then we have the star fall of 1866. This occurred while Baha'u'llah was under house arrest by the Ottoman Empire in the city of Adrianople, now called Edirne. Baha'u'llah himself identified this event as the foretold starfall of Matthew chapter 24. In the column on the right is the spiritual or symbolic sign from heaven. That heavenly sign was the appearance of the Bab, who was the Elijah figure to the new Messiah to come, just as John the Baptist was to Jesus. The Bab forewarned humanity for the 6 years of his earthly ministry of the upcoming appearance of what he referred to as him whom God shall make manifest, meaning the Messiah to all humanity for this new era promised by Jesus. All the heavenly activity in the early, mid, and later 1800s, before and during the revelations of both the Bab and Baha'u'llah, have definitely been fulfilled by both literal events in the sky and the heavenly or spiritual events announcing their imminent appearance. Status: fulfilled. Now we continue with the explanation of verse 30 of chapter 24. The second part of verse 30 of Matthew chapter 24, quote, "And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory," end quote. First, we will concentrate on answering this question. Why would all the peoples of the earth mourn the coming of the Messiah? Notice that it says all the peoples of the earth would mourn. Wouldn't they be happy that the Messiah had come? From the writings of Baha'u'llah, the new Messiah, it explains the result of the oppression from corrupted religion, meaning the mourning by all the peoples of the earth. Quote, "These words signify that in those days men will lament the loss of the sun of divine beauty, of the moon of knowledge, and of the stars of divine wisdom." End quote. In other words, the peoples of the earth will feel the effects of the oppression mentioned earlier in this presentation. This quote also explains the symbolic meaning of Matthew chapter 24, verse 29, about the darkening of the sun, the dimming of the moon, and the falling of the stars, meaning the darkening of the religious leaders and the dimming of the laws of the previous religions. Then the question we must answer is, have the peoples of the earth mourned or lamented the loss of the Son of divine beauty, etc.? Leading up to the 1800s and since, the religious faiths on earth have suffered further splintering of the faiths into even more disparate sects, further corruption in the institutions and clergy of all the existing faiths, further sectarianism, people leaving organized faiths because of perceived problems within them. Many have become concerned in the rising number of what are called nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who, when asked about what religion they practice, they reply none. Segments of the faiths becoming fanatical and or political, often resulting in further divisiveness and even sometimes violence towards those who do not agree. Weakening of adherence to the laws of the religions, introduction of human interpretations or practices that are not fully conforming to the religious laws or even are directly contrary to them. The faith may become more form than substance. Recent events such as sexual abuse of children by the clergy, clergy of some faiths becoming politically involved to the detriment of the teaching of the true faith they profess. People sense that their faith, and all the existing faiths on earth, is in need of change or renewal. Thus they mourn for the original pure faith before it became sullied by the machinations and changes introduced by human beings. Do you sense a need for some renewal in your organized religion? Do you mourn for the condition of spiritual life on this planet at this time? Don't you think we are past due for a manifestation of God to appear with a fresh message from God? As to the clause, they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Something to think about as we go through the explanation of this clause. Keep in mind the language in this verse. It says we would see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, not the clouds of earth. The literal meanings of clouds or clouds of earth are in the left column. The spiritual or symbolic meanings of the clouds of heaven are in the column on the right. Literal clouds on the left, water vapor. In the sky, they're clouds. On the surface, they're fog. Clouds provide rain, lightning, thunder, snow, blizzards, tornadoes, the good and bad of weather systems. Other than tornadoes or high winds, literal clouds cannot physically hold up objects the size or weight of a man. If a man were in a tornado or such forceful winds that could pick him up, it would most likely result in his being smashed into some object at such high speed that it would be fatal. Now, the symbolic meanings of clouds in the right column include that which surrounds or envelops one, like fog, but not literal fog. Clouds obscure or interfere with the ability to discern one's spiritual surroundings. The old saying, cloud your judgment, springs to mind. Clouds, these symbolic clouds, provide rain from heaven, symbolic of the water of life, meaning the spiritual guidance and teachings that come from God through his prophets. Hold on, there's another kind of literal cloud that the Bab and Baha'u'llah have appeared upon. Ever heard of cloud computing? Cloud computing is, per Investopedia.com, quote, the delivery of different services through the internet. These resources include tools and applications like data storage, servers, databases, networking, and software, end quote. For short, it's the cloud of the internet. The Bab and Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith have been on the cloud of the internet for many, many years and have been expanding on that medium. You can find them there. Details on how to access information about them, their writings, teachings, and the Baha'i faith on the internet is given at the end of this video. A question arises from the literal interpretation of the Messiah descending from the sky on a cloud. Of what purpose would God have, or the Messiah have, in literally coming down out of the sky on a cloud? Answer: no one would doubt that the Messiah had come, would they? But God has never made it that easy for us. He has always tested his servants to discern the real believer from the false. It always required us to make decisions to do the work. This no-brainer scenario of the coming of the Messiah would not help humans learn to spiritually discern the true from the false. It would be like you did your child's homework all the time. You would not be doing your child any favors. He has learned nothing from the homework that you did. I can't help but ask a further question. Why didn't Moses or Jesus come that way in the first place? No one would have doubted their being from God then. Or would they? Same answer as above, basically. God is not interested in shortcuts that do not force us, his creation, to grow spiritually. And knowing we humans as we do, you know that some will not believe their eyes, even if he did come down out of the sky. If a person was asleep when he came down on a literal cloud, even if a person saw a video of it, one could easily believe it was just another special effects or faked video. What about the symbolic meaning of rain from heaven? Here is a very logical explanation of what one of the meanings of the clouds of heaven is. This is from the sacred writings of the Baha'i faith written by Baha'u'llah. Quote, "Consider the past, how many, both high and low, have at all times yearningly awaited the advent of the manifestations of God in the sanctified persons of his chosen ones. How often have they expected his coming? How frequently have they prayed that the breeze of divine mercy would blow and the promised beauty step forth from behind the veil of concealment and be made manifest to all the world. And whensoever the portals of grace did open and the clouds of divine bounty did rain upon mankind, and the light of the unseen did shine above the horizon of the celestial might, they all denied him and turned away from his face, the face of God himself. Refer ye to verify this truth, to that which hath been recorded in every sacred book." End quote. That phrase, "the clouds of divine bounty did rain upon mankind," is not referring to real rain, obviously. It is the heavenly rain of the bounties of the divine spirit. Here is another quote from the writings of Baha'u'llah that explains another meaning. Quote, "Thus it is that through the rise of these luminaries of God the world is made new, the waters of everlasting life stream forth, the billows of loving kindness surge, the clouds of grace are gathered, and the breeze of bounty bloweth upon all created things." End quote. And still another quote from Baha'u'llah. Quote, "By this is meant that the divine beauty will be made manifest from the heaven of the will of God, and will appear in the form of the human temple. The term heaven denoteth loftiness and exaltation, inasmuch as it is the seat of the revelation of those manifestations of holiness, the daysprings of ancient glory. These ancient beings, though delivered from the womb of their mother, have in reality descended from the heaven of the will of God. Though they be dwelling on this earth, yet their true habitations are the retreats of glory in the realms above. Whilst walking amongst mortals, they soar in the heaven of the divine presence. Without feet they tread the path of the Spirit, and without wings they arise unto the exalted heights of divine unity. With every fleeting breath they cover the immensity of space, and at every moment traverse the kingdoms of the visible and the invisible. Upon their thrones is written, Nothing whatsoever keepeth him from being occupied with any other thing. And on their seats is inscribed, Verily his ways differ every day. They are sent forth through the transcendent power of the Ancient of Days, and are raised up by the exalted will of God, the most mighty King. This is what is meant by the words coming in the clouds of heaven." End quote. Next, that last part of verse 30 of Matthew 24, where it states that the Son of Man would be coming with power and great glory. It leads us to ask the question, what kind of power and glory might we expect from the new Messiah, the Messiah of the latter days? I think we should start with asking another question. What kind of power and glory did Jesus Christ display? Both would be from God, and the Bible spoke of the glory of Jesus Christ. The New Testament is full of verses that spoke of the glory of Jesus, yet he was without worldly power or the glorification of social position. That's one of the reasons why most Jews did not accept him as the Messiah. Jesus did not command an army and was powerless to save the Jews from their subjugation by the Romans. Jesus did not literally fulfill the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah, who the Jews thought would wield a sword and save his people from Roman rule. We all know that Jesus was glorified by God and by the worship of his followers, yet he died, to outward appearances, a humiliating death. But his glory was not derived from earthly power or wealth. He led no literal army. The swords the prophets of God wield are their words. The swords that come out of their mouths is symbolic for their heavenly teachings. The power and glory of the manifestations of God come from the power of the Holy Spirit, not from physical brute strength. The battles the returned Christ would face would be against the disbelief of powerful entities, just as Jesus the Christ faced. A side remark here on the topic of swords in prophecy. Many people assume that the word sword in a prophecy automatically means that there will be violence, blood, war, misery. But this verse from the book of Revelation, chapter 19, verse 15, which is specifically speaking of the coming of the new Messiah, the returned Christ Spirit, quote, "And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, and he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God." End quote. It's obvious that the sword coming out of the mouth of the Messiah are his words, his teachings that will conquer the nations. And also, FYI, a rod of iron is a means of measuring, of judging something against a standard of behavior. An iron rod isn't a weapon to strike people with. Iron depicts strength and endurance. This measuring rod of the new Messiah will be strong and endure for a long time. So the power and glory of the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ Spirit, will come from his words, his teachings, and the long duration and strength of his dispensation and covenant. Now, back to clouds. Literal-minded prophecy buffs have added together this prophecy of the Messiah coming from heaven on clouds and the verses from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17 that you see here. Quote, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, and with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." End quote. So we get the theory of the rapture where Jesus is supposed to literally come down out of the sky on a cloud, resurrect the dead physical bodies who were professed Christians in life, and then will take them up into the literal sky, up into the air with him. Next, about the use of the word air. What is the word air in heavenly terms? Well, the translation is from the original Greek text of the word aera in the Bible. However, another correct translation is atmosphere. Here is an example of the use of the word atmosphere by the new Messiah for the new age, Baha'u'llah. Quote, "Know thou that he is truly learned who hath acknowledged my revelation, and drunk from the ocean of my knowledge, and soared in the atmosphere of my love, and cast away all else beside me, and taken firm hold on that which hath been sent down from the kingdom of my wondrous utterance. He, verily, is even as an eye unto mankind, and as the spirit of life unto the body of all creation." End quote. Here Baha'u'llah speaks of the soul soaring into the atmosphere of God's love. I believe that Jesus had been talking to his followers about this type of soaring, not bodily being picked up off the face of the earth, but rather this type of soaring into the atmosphere of God's love. A spiritual condition, not a physical one. Also, notice at the bottom where he says, "the spirit of life unto the body of all creation." Remember the verse about the dead in Christ rising first? And this is yet another example from the writings of Baha'u'llah, wherein he mentions soaring towards God in this day. Quote, "This is the day on which the bird of utterance hath warbled its melody upon the branches.
in the name of his Lord, the God of mercy. Blessed is the man that hath, on the wings of longing, soared towards God, the Lord of the judgment day." End quotes. This is spiritual soaring, not going up into the sky. So you will have to make a decision as to what makes more spiritual sense of the translation and use of this Greek word aero. Bodily soaring into the sky versus soaring into the atmosphere of God's love. Now we come to the part of the prophecy where it states, "The dead in Christ will rise first." Rise to what? Rise to go up into the sky, or rise to soar in the atmosphere of the love of God brought by the new Messiah, per our discussion about the proper translation of the Greek word aero? My answer is obvious, the answer that is most logical. Those who would not be followers of Jesus the Christ will be the first to recognize the new Messiah when he comes, before Christians would. So the dead in Christ are those who are not followers of Jesus. The new Messiah would first be accepted by people who were not Christians, the dead in Christ. Fulfillment of this verse came about when the Bab and Baha'u'llah appeared in the mostly Muslim land of Persia, and their first believers were primarily Muslims, not Christians. But Christians, like me, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, tribal faiths, and others all over the globe have followed and become believers too, and thus entered the atmosphere of God's wisdom and love, meaning we followers of Baha'u'llah were raptured. After all that oppression, formerly termed tribulation, now called distress in the New International Version of the Bible, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, fulfilled. And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, fulfilled. And the dead in Christ will rise first, fulfilled. Will be caught with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, fulfilled when Baha'u'llah's followers recognized and responded spiritually to the new revelation from God. They soared in the atmosphere of God's love, in other words. So far, all verses of prophecy are fulfilled. On to verse 31, quote, "And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other." End quote. We will begin by discussing the loud trumpet call that announced the coming of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. This map again, showing the location of the largest, loudest blast that humankind has heard and put on the record, that of the loud blast of the explosion of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815, just before the births of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. The blast was so loud it was heard 1,400 miles away. Recall that the volcanic ash spewed into the atmosphere resulted in some dark days throughout much of South Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and even into North America. The ash in the atmosphere resulted in Europe in the year 1816 that was called the Year Without Summer, because it was so cold all summer. That was a literal trumpet call. Another type of trumpet call was the second and third Great Awakenings in the Christian world in the early 1800s and mid to late 1800s respectively. With the third Great Awakening, it included the Advent movement, when expectations of the return of Christ became so loud and as insistent trumpet calls, primarily among Protestants. Many thousands of people became convinced that the time prophecies in the books of Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 4, and Revelation chapter 11 proved that the Messiah was to return in 1844. Note some of the first calculations foretold the year 1843,
But people had not remembered that there is no year zero between the BC dates and the AD dates. Therefore, these first calculations were wrong. The corrected date was, for most of these prophecy fans, was 1844. For a more detailed explanation of why the year 1844 is pinpointed as the year of the coming of the Messiah, see my video titled Christ Has Returned, which is focused on Bible time prophecies of the appearance of the Messiah of the latter days. Who made these predictions of the imminent appearance of the returned Christ? Here's a list of some of them. And by the way, the dates of after each name are their dates of birth and death. I won't read them to you, just want you to understand how many people studied this 2300-day prophecy in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, and figured out that the end point would be in the early to mid 1840s. Of special note is the one with the yellow arrows pointing to it at the bottom right. That is William Miller, a farmer and Bible prophecy scholar from Vermont and New York states. He is of special note because of the many thousands of people that came to follow him, and others who came to also study the prophecies and also came out with the dates 1843 to 1844 as when Christ would return. William Miller was so important in the Advent movement that his story and his followers, the Millerites, will be briefly told in the next few slides. William Miller's study of the Bible, after much prayer and devotion, led to his discovery of the meaning of the 2300-day or 2300-year prediction in Daniel. His preaching about the imminent return of Christ started the Millerite movement. He traveled the country teaching of the coming of the second advent of Christ. As mentioned, his large body of followers came to be called the Millerites. He first predicted the return was to occur in 1843, then realized his math error because there is no year zero in the calendars. Then he predicted March 21st, 1844 would be the day, probably because that was the first day of the Jewish month of Nisan, which would have made it 2300 years exactly since Daniel made that prediction. When nothing happened that day, he changed it to October 22nd, 1844, for reasons unknown. On the expected date and time of March 21st, 1844, thousands assembled throughout the United States, Europe, and some other places throughout the world to await Christ's return down from the sky. Christ did not show up as expected. And then same thing for the October 22nd date that he subsequently foretold Christ would come on. Christ didn't show up then either. Christ not coming down from the sky with literal trumpets blaring for the whole world to see was a huge letdown and became known as the Great Disappointment. Just a thought. Why do you suppose he didn't show up? Was the Bible wrong, do you think? Something has bothered me since I first read about the Millerites and their huge disappointment. They're standing on the mountains and hills awaiting his coming down out of the sky, only to be so excruciatingly disappointed. But then why did no one go out in search of someone in the world having declared that he was the promised one? Now for verse 36, quote, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." End quote. This verse 36 seems to always be mentioned by Christians when I try to tell them that the Messiah has returned. They say, he couldn't have returned because the Bible says that we won't know the day or the hour. Well, quite often this is used as an excuse to not even investigate. Remember, Jesus said to be watchful. The thief in the night would come unannounced, and that you should watch for him. So in effect, this verse has become one of the clouds that obscures the coming of the Messiah, the clouds that were prophesied in this chapter of Matthew. And we now know the day and hour because it happened already and is in the past. The Bab proclaimed his mission and station as a manifestation of God, the forerunner to the Messiah who would appear very soon after him. Again, to reiterate, the day and the hour are now known. And this is it, May 23rd, 1844, at 2 hours after sunset. Now you know. From the writings of Baha'u'llah, quote, "The hour which we had concealed from the knowledge of the peoples of the earth and of the favored angels hath come to pass." End quote. A couple slides follow that are quotes, messages from the Messiah of the latter days, addressed to you and to all the peoples of the world. From the pen of Baha'u'llah, quote, "Say, O followers of the Son, Jesus Christ, have ye shut out yourselves from me by reason of my name? Wherefore ponder ye not in your hearts? Day and night ye have been calling upon your Lord, the Omnipotent, but when he came from the heaven of eternity in his great glory, ye turned aside from him and remained sunk in heedlessness. Consider those who rejected the Spirit, Jesus Christ, when he came unto them with manifest dominion. How numerous the Pharisees who had secluded themselves in synagogues in his name, lamenting over their separation from him. And yet when the portals of reunion were flung open, and the divine luminary shone resplendent from the dayspring of beauty, they disbelieved in God, the exalted, the mighty. They failed to attain his presence, notwithstanding that his advent had been promised them in the book of Isaiah, as well as in the books of the prophets and the messengers. No one from among them turned his face towards the dayspring of divine bounty, except such as were destitute of any power amongst men. And yet today every man endowed with power and invested with sovereignty prideth himself on his name. Moreover, call thou to mind the one who sentenced Jesus to death. He was the most learned of his age in his own country, whilst he, who was only a fisherman, believed in him. Take good heed, and be of them that observe the warning." And here is an excerpt from a tablet Baha'u'llah wrote to the kings of the earth, but it applies to all leaders of the various nations on earth. Quote, "O kings of the earth, he who is the sovereign Lord of all is come. The kingdom is God's, the omnipotent protector, the self-subsisting. Worship none but God, and with radiant hearts lift up your faces unto your Lord, the Lord of all names. This is a revelation to which whatever ye possess can never be compared, could ye but know it. We see you rejoicing in that which ye have amassed for others, and shutting out yourselves from the worlds which naught except my guarded tablet can reckon. The treasures ye have laid up have drawn you far away from your ultimate objective. This ill beseemeth you, could ye but understand it. Wash your hearts from all earthly defilements, and hasten to enter the kingdom of your Lord, the Creator of earth and heaven, who caused the world to tremble, and all its peoples to wail, except them that have renounced all things, and clung to that which the hidden tablet hath ordained." And this excerpt from his book, titled Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah, quote, "Call out to Zion, O Carmel, and announce the joyful tidings. He that was hidden from mortal eyes is come. His all-conquering sovereignty is manifest. His all-encompassing splendor is revealed. Beware lest thou hesitate or halt. Hasten forth and circumambulate the city of God that hath descended from heaven, the celestial Kaaba." That's a metaphorical reference to the new revelation of God, "round which have circled in adoration the favored of God, the pure in heart, and the company of the most exalted angels. Oh, how I long to announce unto every spot on the surface of the earth, and to carry to each one of its cities the glad tidings of this revelation, a revelation to which the heart of Sinai hath been attracted, and in whose name the burning bush is calling, unto God the Lord of Lords belong the kingdoms of earth and heaven. Verily, this is the day in which both land and sea rejoice at this announcement, the day for which have been laid up those things which God, through a bounty beyond the ken of mortal mind or heart, hath destined for a revelation. Ere long will God sail his ark upon thee, and will manifest the people of Baha, who have been mentioned in the Book of Names. End quote. Your course on Matthew chapter 24 is almost completed. All that remains is the exam. Your test consists of whether you choose to investigate the claims of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and the Baha'i faith, or not. Your test results will only be graded by yourself and God.
That concludes the explanations of how the Baha'i Faith's founding figures, the Bab and Baha'u'llah, fulfilled Bible prophecies of the return of the Christ Spirit, the Messiah of the latter days.
The next several slides give some information sources to find out more about the Baha'i Faith, its history, founders, laws, etc. Included are videos, websites, and some books. I recommend that you watch this professionally produced 30-minute video on the life of Baha'u'llah and the start of the Baha'i Faith as an introduction. Its title is The Prisoner of Akka. To access this video, go to YouTube and to the channel named Baha'i Vision, as you see at the bottom of the slide, and look for the video by that name, The Prisoner of Akka. You may also just be able to enter the title into the YouTube search box, The Prisoner of Akka, and then look for this exact title. A great way to get authoritative insight into the mission of the Bab and the history of the beginnings of the new faith called the Baha'i Faith, this professionally produced documentary brings to life the opening drama of the continuance of the greatest story ever told. Its title is The Gate, Dawn of the Baha'i Faith. It's available for free on YouTube, and it's about 1 hour in length. The easiest way to get to it on YouTube is to, you get to YouTube first, youtube.com, and then you enter into the search box at the top the name of the channel, and that's at the bottom right hand corner of the slide here. That channel is The Gate Film, all one word with no spaces between. The Gate Film. Note that there are numerous versions in a variety of languages, so you want to make sure you select a version in the language of your choice.
Now this video is a must-watch. It's titled Christ Has Returned. It's one of my videos on my channel that you see at the bottom there, Integral Destiny 9. It explains in detail Bible time prophecies that tell when the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ, would appear, and how the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and the Baha'i Faith fulfill those time prophecies. Here are some official Baha'i websites. Top one there is www.bahai.org. That's the international official website for those seeking information about the Baha'i Faith, and it has a link to the online library of sacred and authoritative texts that are accessible for free. Next is www.bahai.us. That's the USA official website for seekers who want information about the Baha'i community in the United States. Then we have Baha'i.org/library, and that is accessed
again free, to the sacred and authoritative texts and other publications by worldwide Baha'i community. Then at the bottom, the USA bookstore, that's BahaiBookstore.com. It's the official online bookstore for the USA. You can purchase books, videos, music, and some other items through this site as well. You don't have to be a Baha'i to purchase things.
The National Organization of the Baha'is of the United States has a presence on both Facebook and its own YouTube channel. Both of their pages in these websites goes by the name Baha'is of the United States. More websites. Top one, BahaiTeachings.org. This is a blog site where you can find numerous articles written about subjects touching on the Baha'i faith and the teachings. It's not an official site, but rather is produced by some individual Baha'is. There's a variety of topics in here, so if you have any specific topic, you can go on there and try to find articles to enlighten you what the view from the Baha'i faith might be. Next is the access address to the YouTube channel of the Wilmette Institute, which is an online Baha'i educational site that has webinars and actual online courses. Some are free and some at a cost, on a wide spectrum of Baha'i topics. The easiest way to get there is to go to youtube.com, then in the search box put their channel name, which is, as you see there, Wilmette Institute. We have a Baha'i World News Service which can be reached through the website. You see there https://news.baha'i.org. And then to read some examples of some Baha'i prayers, go to www.bahaiprayers.org. If you'd like to find a book that gives a good, interesting overview of the Baha'i faith, its main figures, history, beliefs, and its followers, without being preachy or trying to convert you, this is the book for you. Its title is Baha'u'llah and the New Era by the author J.E. Esselmont. It's available through Amazon.com and probably other online book vendors too. It may even be in your local library or your local independent bookstore. Here's a list of many of my other videos, all on YouTube, mostly on prophecy fulfillment by the main four founding figures of the Baha'i faith. You can read the titles. There's a variety of topics. Pause the video to review them to see if any might interest you. Instructions on how to access them, all for free, on YouTube is on the next slide. Here's how to find my videos on YouTube. You have to get to YouTube first in the first method, and that is www.youtube.com. You get to the site, and in the search box on that site you enter my channel name of Integral Destiny 9. You see there, all one word, no spaces between, with the number 9 at the end. Or you can simply put the URL into the search box of your, like Google, whatever, www.youtube.com/c/ then my YouTube channel, Integral Destiny 9, as you see there. And that should get you directly there, so I understand. And you'll see a list of videos, and you just have to roam around on my channel and find those videos. Please note that this video is an amateur production by this singular person, me. It is not an official production of the Baha'i faith community.
Copyright protections are claimed. Please do not make changes, additions, or deletions to this presentation. Questions? Contact me at the email address you see there, and of course, thanks for watching. Bye.